No, he doesn't have memory problems. He has attention problems. But I was only able to see that because I gave a very specific test that looked at memory. And in this kid's scenario, he was able to sustain his attention. And again, think about what he was doing, closing his eyes, holding his head in his hand. We're really trying to block out all other stimuli just to show he actually remembers things that people tell him quite well. But that doesn't happen in the real world, because in the real world, when the kid next to him is tapping his pen, he can't concentrate on what the teacher is saying, right? Welcome to another episode of the Prepared School Psych Podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Ponzuric. Today's episode is in response to a listener's question. As you know, we offer a 2-week free trial to the Prepared School Psych community to all of our listeners. If you have never taken me up on that offer, head over to jennyponzuric.com/podcast and follow the directions to obtain free access. Our listener asked, what type of content do we add to the community each week or each month? And yes, each week we add at least one new resource. So I thought I would share one of our video resources with all of you. Each month during the 2024-25 school year, I am reading a book. At the beginning of the month, I release a video of my takeaways from that book. And then at the end of each month, I host a call where members can ask questions about the book or chat about their takeaways. I also like to share how I've been applying that book. Not too long ago, I read The Essentials of the WRAML3 book. Now, even if you or your district do not own this awesome memory test, there were some wonderful takeaways from this book about memory evaluation in general. So I'm going to play this video for you, and now you understand the context of the video. Enjoy. Hey everyone, Jenny Ponzuric here. And in this video, we are going to start our discussion about my key learnings from this book right here, The Essentials of the WRAML3 and EMS Assessment. Now, as I was reading through this book, which I love, and by the way, not that thick of a, essentials book, so pretty easy reading here. As I was reading through this and trying to figure out how to share with all of you my key takeaways, I tended to group the things that I was underlining and then highlighting into kind of two major sections. One of them was specific to the WRAML3, and that's going to be the second video. In this video, we're just going to talk about some really cool things that I learned from the book or reminded myself from this book that's just about memory in general. So that whether you use the WRAML3, you use a different memory test, you don't use a memory test every single time, you wonder when you should be looking at memory, I wanted to kind of separate these two conversations here. So in this first one, we're just going to talk about memory. Now, in regards to a memory model, there are a lot of different ones that exist, and I found it interesting that the authors of this test did not subscribe to any particular memory model. Now, for those of you who would like to have a little bit more structure or, again, remind yourself of some things we probably all learned in grad school about memory, at the end of this video, I'm going to share with you a couple of resources. So if you want to take a little bit deeper of a dive into some different memory models, for me, having a memory model kind of in mind is helpful for me when I'm explaining results, right, to a family, to be able to talk about how things are connected with one another. So that's why I think it's important for us to have kind of just an understanding of a memory model that makes sense to us. And again, at the end of this video, I'll share with you a couple of resources. Now, one of the things that this book reminded me about is it can be difficult to distinguish whether or not the student's low performance on a memory test, whether, again, that's the WRAML, the CHAMP, the TOML, however you pronounce that test name. I've heard it in a couple of different ways. We have memory tests on so many different of our broad cognitive tools. However, one of the issues that we have all the time is trying to figure out if I have a low score, is it actually a memory problem, or is there a different underlying reason for that low score in memory? So, for example, executive functioning. Is a student just not actually coming up with any sort of strategy during a memory test? Are they not able to organize all the information that's coming at them? Is it just an attention problem? Of course, students with attention problems are likely going to have issues with memory if they're not paying attention to the stimulus that they're first being exposed to. And you and I work with students all the time who have attention problems. And a lot of times when we're doing memory testing, we do a lot of prompting like, are you ready? Like, I need your full attention here before I give you the next set of numbers. And then, of course, social emotional concerns, right? Like mood regulation. That can be the underlying reason for a memory problem or a low memory score. And so I think these are important things for us to connect, because there are times that we get low scores on a memory test, but with all of the information that we have, I don't know how much I want to talk about this as a memory problem versus an attention problem. So this is probably my best example. It was with the last version of the WRAML2. And I remember I was giving the evaluation to, I think he was in 9th grade at the time. And of course, like most of us, when I'm doing the evaluation with him, we are in a pretty quiet room, right? It's just me and him. There really weren't any outside noises to distract. And I'll never forget when I was doing story memory with this student. His eyes were closed. His head was actually in his hands. And he was attempting to give like full focus on this memory test. There was no motivation issues for this kid at all. He was really in it. His score on story memory was a 16. This is why I remember this student, because I don't think I've ever in my 25 years seen a score on story memory of a 16. Now, not only did he remember it in the moment, that immediate memory, but when I went back and did the delayed and the recognition, he remembered all of it as well. And I remember when I did the debrief with the student. So at that point, we're probably talking at least 2 weeks, if not more. By the time I'm sitting down, finish the report, and I'm actually talking with the student and sharing the results with them. And I remember saying like how amazing his memory was. And he looked at me and he goes, do you want me to tell you about that story? Because I still remember it. This is weeks later. He still could tell me almost all of the different parts from that story. Now, why I remember it, not only because he had a score of 16, but because of this. When I told his parent and his teachers about this amazing memory skill that he demonstrated during this testing, they were all flabbergasted because this child can't remember anything in the classroom setting. Why? He's super ADHD. Super ADHD. Like, no question about that diagnosis. However, in this very controlled setting that was nothing like the real world, he actually was able to demonstrate he has amazing memory skills. But his teacher would have never marked his memory as an area of strength. In actuality, the feedback was, I think he has memory problems. No, he doesn't have memory problems. He has attention problems. But I was only able to see that because I gave a very specific test that looked at memory. And in this kid's scenario, he was able to sustain his attention. And again, think about what he was doing, closing his eyes, holding his head in his hand. We're really trying to block out all other stimuli just to show he actually remembers things that people tell him quite well. But that doesn't happen in the real world, because in the real world, when the kid next to him is tapping his pen, he can't concentrate on what the teacher is saying, right? These things are so intertwined with one another. And that's one of the fun things we get to do when we're evaluating students. We're looking at the score profile that were obtained. We're looking at all the other information that we have received from the student. We're trying to figure out what aligns, what doesn't align, and when it doesn't align, what's the explanation for that? This book did talk about, of course, some common causes of memory problems. And I thought these were some important ones as I think about the students that so many of us work with. Now, traumatic brain injuries, hopefully, are pretty far and less frequent than your typical student. But definitely when you have a student who has had a TBI, memory problems is definitely an area we need to take a look at, as well as executive functioning. Those are two things that typically are impacted quite a bit for our kids with brain injuries. But look at the other two as well: drug abuse and prescribed medication side effects. This is one of the reasons, let's go with the last one about medications. This is one of the reasons why we need to know about what medications the student is taking and whether or not they're experiencing any side effects. I remember another high school student that I was working with, and she had depression. She knew it. We all knew it. She was on medication for it. And I remember when we were doing some memory testing together, she was very self-reflective and just looked at me and says, I am having a really hard time concentrating. And she goes, it's this medication, but it really helps with my depression. But I have a really hard time remembering information. Now, I'm not going to call that a memory problem per se. Like, her brain has the capability of remembering information. She was a high school student who had been in special ed for a number of years. So we could look back at previous testing and go, no, this isn't like a memory problem. This is a side effect from the medication problem. So we need to figure out what are some strategies that we can use right now, because this medication is working for the main reason why she's taking it, but it's causing these other things. What are some strategies? What are some accommodations that we need to put in place here for the student at this particular time? And then those of you who are working with students, many times we're asking questions about drug abuse, trying to figure out if kids are going to actually be truthful with us, right? But that knowledge can help actually take a look at, is this low memory score due to that? Or do we have any other data sources to indicate that this has actually been an ongoing issue and is not primarily due to the drug abuse? And giving a memory test, whether that's the WRAML, another tool, or a fun test on the DOS, the CAS, the WIS, the WJ, that doesn't answer those questions. That's why we have to look at all of the data that we have, all of the sources of data to try and pinpoint, are we calling this like a learning disability and a memory issue? Or is this just because you're taking substances you're not supposed to be taking? Now, I don't know about you. I love anything to do with the brain. Definitely got my school neuropsych certificate. Love that. Loved all that learning I got. So there's not a quiz at the end of this. Most of the time, parents don't ask us questions about what memory area. I put this on here to really bring home the point that there's not one area that's associated with memory. Most of us remember, pun intended, that from grad school, like the hippocampus is definitely involved in memory, right? I always remember teaching my students, the hippo goes to the campus to learn and remember. So that's how we remember the hippocampus is involved in memory and learning. But there are many other areas that are also involved. The amygdala is involved because emotions can be important for memory as well. Many of us have very strong memories of some very emotional moments in our life. They can be like moments that like are historical moments. And I remember where I was. I remember what I was wearing at this exact time and day. So that can be some like national events. There can be some events in our family as well. That those memories are just seared in our brain because the emotion that's attached to it. So the amygdala is part of that at times as well. Again, I bring this up, there's not one specific part of our brain that's involved. And when we have kids who have any sort of tumors, any sort of car accident, any sort of concussions, there's so many different parts of the brain that are involved. We don't want to wait for it to say only specifically one of these areas. That's why anytime you have a kid with a traumatic brain injury, it's important to take a look at memory skills. Now, this is just me being a little bit of a nerd about memory. I found this fact so interesting. 30% of all synapses in the brain's cortex, they are shelved and silenced, and they don't become active until we're adults. And they're just hanging out there waiting for us to have like a memory that we need to remember. How cool is that? That our brain is like, I got some things ready for you. We are not using this neuron and all these synapses. It is just waiting, and we're not using it for anything else, just in case you want to remember something. When you're an adult, how cool is that? I love the brain. Okay, that was my nerd moment. I'm going to move forward. This I thought was really interesting because I get questions frequently working with psychologists and planning evaluations and reviewing reports in regards to giving an immediate memory task and the delayed ones. And that's one of the benefits from a task from something like the WRAML or the CHAMP or the TOML is that we have those delayed tasks. Those exist on some of our other tools as well. I found this so interesting. The greatest amount of memory loss occurs within the first 20 to 30 minutes. In case you're wondering why almost every memory task makes us wait about 20 to 30 minutes before we administer the delayed task, there's a reason behind that number. The greatest amount of memory loss occurs within the first 20 to 30 minutes. So, adding the delayed components, when we have that capability, it reflects better real-world aspects of memory. Because again, most of the time for our students, when we're talking about their memory skills, it's not just, I heard what you said, let me repeat it right back to you. It is actually like, is it getting in there? Is it staying in there? So when people ask me, so for example, on the KABC, there are 2 learning tasks, Atlantis and Rebus. And people always ask me, do I give the delayed? And my response is, if it works out for the timing, right? Sometimes the bell rings and I wasn't paying attention and the kid gets up and goes to recess, and no, I can't do it. There are always interesting circumstances, but in general, whether I am giving something from a memory test, whether I'm giving those tasks from the KDC, something from the NEPC, I typically plan on the delayed components. Why? Because if someone says, I think the kid has a memory issue, that's where we're going to probably see it most often, not always in the immediate. So when you have parents and teachers and students who are talking about memory, that's my first thought is, oh, I got to make sure I get a memory task in here that has a delayed component. I always want to do that if that is something that is specifically brought up by somebody. Now, we're going to talk about this in our next video as well. The term ecological validity is used here to talk about making sure that a low score that we find on something like the WRAML is actually a valid score in the classroom setting. Meaning, did my kid just have a bad moment? Was my kid just not truly motivated for this amazing evaluation session with me? Or does it actually make sense because someone else brought up that they think the kid has a memory issue? And the teacher can give you 3 instances in the last week where they noticed something like this. How many times do we have parents who talk about, I was driving the kid to school and we were studying for that test, that whole drive into school. They went to go take that test first thing in the morning and they couldn't remember anything. Well, that is some data that we are talking about. So that if I get a low memory score, I'm like, well, this makes sense. That's what we want to make sure. Whether it's an issue with memory, whether it's an issue with phonemic awareness, whether it's an issue with fluid reasoning, we want to make sure we're always looking at those additional resources to support that low score has credibility to it. We don't just test kids and talk about the test results. Our obligation is to look at these students and try and figure out truly what is going on. And this low score, is that an actual explanation of what we're seeing in this classroom environment? Now, as I mentioned, there are a couple of extra resources here. And right near this video, you will see a couple of links. Basic psychological processes. I know some of you inside this group are also members of my PSW monthly group. And if you are members of that, you already have free access to basic psychological processes, which is an 8 different module look at basic psychological processes, one of which is memory. So there are a couple of additional videos from me over there. Now, if you're not already part of that group, if you follow the link right near this video, right on our assessment page within the Prepared School Psych community, you will also see a link to the basic psychological processes. And if you are working in a district that is not using PSW, there is another way for you to access the basic psychological processes at a huge discounted price. Okay. Now, one of the first things that I thought about when I was reading this book was the school neuropsych program. So I did do Dr. Dan Miller's school neuropsychology program, schoolneuropsych.com, and that program does a huge deep dive into memory. And so for those of you who have participated in that, or you have colleagues who have participated in that, there are some great resources within that program. And then I just listed 4 books here. We have the best practices in school neuropsychology. And then if you skip to the bottom one, the essentials of school neuropsychological assessment for all of you fans of essentials books. And then the other 2 are books written by Dr. Milton Dean. He loves talking about memory, loves talking about it. So he's got an essentials book about memory, and then he has another book about long-term memory problems. And in those books specifically, there are a number of resources that may support that piece we were just talking about in regards to ecological validity, meaning there are interview questions, there are classroom behaviors that you might notice when you're observing a student that likely is attributed to memory issues. So when you're going through this video and you heard me say, we want to make sure we have other data sources, you might have been wondering, like, well, what questions should I be asking? Dr. Dean's and all of his books always give you lots of great ways to ask questions at whatever developmental level of students that you are working with that can help bring those other data sources to you so that we all feel comfortable and confident going into that meeting. I don't want to walk into a meeting and say a kid has a memory problem when the parent's like, what are you talking about? The kid has an amazing memory. I hope this was helpful for all of you. Again, I could talk about memory a lot longer. These are just some of the highlights from the Essentials book on the WRAML, but it was just specifically about memory, like in general, not specific to the actual test. All right. In our next video, we're going to get into some of the takeaways from the actual test, the WRAML3. I will see you all soon. That concludes another episode of the Prepared School Psych Podcast. And I hope today's discussion equipped you not just with knowledge, but also the confidence to take action. Remember, every conversation we have and every resource we share builds a bridge towards a more inclusive and empowering learning landscape for our students. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more insightful conversations and resources to support your journey. Share this podcast with colleagues. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder, everyone, the information and advice provided in this podcast are for guidance purposes only, and all listeners are required to follow both federal and state law and their own school district guidelines and policies. Thank you.